But I want to start with the Indiana Pacers. Of course, the most notable team in Indiana right now that's playing is the only professional team truly that's playing right now in the Indiana Pacers. Let's check in on where they are at the All-Star break. Obviously, they wrap up their pre-All-Star session, I suppose, with that overtime win on the road against the Washington Wizards. And then they come into the All-Star break. Pascal Siakam goes off to play. The rest of them hang back for the most part. And now we're looking at a situation where on Thursday, the Pacers return to play at home against the Grizzlies. And I want to sort of look at what they've done so far, what they have left to prove, and what their ceiling and floor is in the regular season and postseason moving forward. First of all, of course, congratulations to Pascal Siakam. He had some good moments in the All-Star game, despite the All-Star game having not very many good moments as a whole across the board. But he had 4 points. He had that moment where he, I believe, had two, and then steal, turnover, got the ball back, 2-on-1 situation, gave the ball up to Trae Young. He scored. So led to some points there in the first game. His team, of course, won the first game and then lost the second. Not a huge deal, but I enjoyed watching Pascal Siakam. Of course, Zach Edey, Trace Jackson Davis were in there as well. So the question for me right now is, how do we feel right now about the Indiana Pacers? They are 30-23. They're number 4 in the East, 5.5 games behind the 3 seed in the New York Knicks, and 1 game above the Milwaukee Bucks at the 5 spot. They are also notably only 2 games above Detroit. So there's sort of a drop-off. We're seeing a clear 3 in the Cavs, the Celtics, and the Knicks at the top of the Eastern Conference. There's a slight drop-off, and then you have the Pacers and the Bucks and the Pistons and maybe the Heat. And the Pacers are at the top of that next best category, which is, I wouldn't say similar to what we saw last season, but it is similar in the sense that the Pacers were close to the top of that rest of the best category, where you had your, at least in the eyes of some people, the true contenders at the top with the Knicks and the Celtics and whoever else you want to put in that category. And then you kind of had a middle-of-the-pack playoff team range. The Pacers were in there. They got hot at the end of the year, ended up taking themselves all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals. Right now, again, they find themselves at the top of that best of the rest heat, perhaps 5.5 games behind the 3 seed in the New York Knicks. They're 14-8 in home games. They're 15-14 on the road. But in the last 10 games, the Pacers have been 6-4. Last 5, 2-3. Last 3, 1-2. Their last game, of course, is that overtime win on the road against one of the worst teams in the league in terms of record, in the Washington Wizards after the Kyle Kuzma, Chris Middleton trade. And then they lost to the Knicks and the Lakers, 2 playoff teams, and I would say bona fide championship contenders in their own right just before that. So let's talk about the recent results, but I want to, before that, get to the progression of the season as a whole, because the Pacers really did start slow, and it's not a secret. Everybody pretty much understands that the Pacers started slow in October. They had a rough start. They started 2-3. They were 1-2 in 3 consecutive one-possession games. There were some litmus tests early on, because the question was whether or not the Pacers, because they really did bring back everyone, and they really did have all the pieces and even more with Benedict Mathurin, of course, returning, and Tyrese Halliburton being fully healthy. They had all the pieces that they had in that Eastern Conference Finals run before. And the question was early on in October, they're going to play the Knicks on the road and they're going to play the Celtics on home. That's a fantastic litmus test to see how the Pacers stack up against the East. And they got blown away by the Knicks right away in Madison Square Garden, and they had a narrow overtime win over Boston. And after October, you saw that the Pacers were 2-3 and got blown away by the Knicks, and it felt like maybe they were taking a step back. And yes, it's true that the Pacers had a very slow start. They ended up being 7-8 in November, 7-7 in December. Sure, this isn't horrific. This is still play-in range level play. But if the Pacers were going to be considered a title contender, as we thought they would be going in, this was not the results that we would want to see. They became a slightly below average play-in caliber team, the Pacers of a few years ago, right? And that was the case because of poor perimeter defense, the lack of a true star. Tyrese Halliburton was Pascal Siakam's not built to be the guy. Of course, we saw in Toronto, right? Kawhi, and then you had Kyle Lowry, and then Pascal Siakam in terms of stardom, right? He was maybe third on the pecking order on that Raptors team. And the Pacers here, they have Tyrese Halliburton and Pascal Siakam as maybe number 2 instead in terms of who your stars are. And Tyrese being at 1 and not playing well. He was slumping bad the entire first half of the year, and Nesmith and Nembhard went down with injury. Of course, the front court got decimated, had to sign Thomas Bryant. The Pacers were struggling to sort of find their footing, and then the calendar turned to January, and they started their resurgence before the new year, but really at the turn of the calendar is when the Pacers started to pop. Seemingly out of nowhere, they went 10-2 in January. They were the best team in 2025 for a while. They knocked off Cleveland. They ripped off multiple 5+ game win streaks in a row. Meaning winning 5+ games in a row. Those win streaks, I suppose they weren't happening all in a row. Otherwise, that'd be a 10-game win streak of some sorts. But they got to a point where they even winning 6 in a row against good teams with strong players, strong rosters. And that team happened, or that happened really because the team got healthy. Thomas Bryant started playing well. Halliburton returned, and more supporting cast guys emerged as stardom-capable playmakers. And we saw what a Pacers team, fully healthy and turned on, what they are capable of doing. We saw that in this period of time at the beginning of January when they were the best team in the league since the start of the new year. And then, of course, as we mentioned, the recent struggles, they've sort of tapered off a little bit. Miles Turner has been out. He's a game-time decision at the moment with a neck injury. He had an inadvertent hit. I forget which game that occurred in, but it was an unfortunate, random, unlucky play. And what's difficult about the loss of Miles Turner is that's a loss in the front court and a loss in the backcourt. And because, right, he shoots threes at a very high level and also, of course, is one of the big men that is down low on defense. Miles Turner's a great player. He's all over the floor. He has an impact everywhere he is, and that's part of the reason why the Pacers have been so good. And him coming out during a West Coast swing when we're starting to play playoff caliber teams again, and the stretch the stretch of the schedule became a little bit more difficult. That's where you started to see the impact of the loss of Miles Turner really showing itself. On top of that, the schedule hasn't really treated us well, right? This team is 4-3 in February. They've had some shaky wins as well, but they went to Paris, came back for 2 home games, and then went on a 4-game West Coast swing. And the first game they had at home when they came back was the Knicks. That ended up being a loss as well. And then turn around, go way back out to Washington to play the Wizards, and then we had the All-Star break. So this team has really experienced some whiplash without Miles Turner. A lot of fatigue going overseas, back at home, then all the way out west, and then a lot of back and forth in terms of travel, and that's really made, I think, contributed to some of the struggles of the Pacers. On top of that, their win streak was primarily, of course, against inferior opponents that are maybe play-in range or even below that. And now the Pacers started to play teams like the Clippers, and they started to play teams like the Lakers and the Knicks. Dropped a few games there. They beat the Clippers, but they had a very slow start in that game as well. Had to come back and fight for it. So they've been in some close games against the Jazz and the Wizards on this West Coast swing. They've lost straight up to playoff teams. The Pacers are not quite playing like a title contender right now, but I want to take that with a grain of salt because, yes, Miles Turner has been out, and the team has been going all over the world, it feels like, quite literally, in the last few weeks and really the last month. So coming out of the All-Star break is an opportunity for the Pacers to settle in, right? They play 4 consecutive home games to start. 3 of them, the first 3, are against West playoff teams. The rest of February looks like this. It has Memphis at home on Thursday. I may attend that game. I think it's going to be fantastic. The Clippers, another playoff team in the West. The Nuggets they'll play, and the Raptors. That should be an easy one to round it out. And then they're going to go to Miami to play their rival. That's an opportunity where it's a tough stretch, but most of those games are at home, which is a nice break for the Pacers. I would love to see this team go 4-1. I would more than happily take 3-2. 2-3 I would accept because it's not outrageous to suggest that they just lose to all 3 of those West playoff teams or maybe drop a game on the road against the Heat. I would accept 2-3. 1-4 or 0-5 is when you're really starting to be concerned about the Pacers on a larger scale. I don't think that will happen by any means. It's a manageable but challenging and testing, perhaps, end of February after the All-Star break, and I'm interested to see how that set of 5 games goes for Indiana. March is also not that bad. Only 5 of the 17 games occurring in March are against top 6 playoff teams. What I mean by that is teams in the top 6 of the East and the top 6 in the West. That's what I mean when I say playoff teams on this show, just as a general rule of thumb. And if I see play-in range teams, I'm meaning the 7 to 10, and then outside of that is, of course, the teams outside of that, surefire lottery pick teams. So March, to me, honestly, isn't that bad because the only teams that they play in the top 6 of the conference on either side, there's only 5 of them. 3 of those games are at home as well. So again, a manageable month of March, and then April, of course, is when the season starts to sputter out. They end with the Cavs twice in 1 week. They also will go to Denver. If they're in a close race at the end of March, they could drop a couple games against the Nuggets and the Cavaliers late in the season, And that could be where we're looking at the difference between a 4 or 5 seed, because keep in mind, the Pacers are just a game and a half above, or really one game ahead of the Milwaukee Bucks for the 4 seed, and the Bucks have beaten the Pacers twice already this season, and they'll play 2 more times again in the month of March. So what's important to me is that the Pacers need to be at least, I would say, and this is generous, if they're 4 games above the Bucks, that'd be fantastic. I think I want them to be at least 2 to 3 games ahead of the Bucks or the Pistons, whoever's right below them, for the 4 seed. And we'll talk about this in terms of ceiling and floor in a second, but I think the 3 seed is largely out of reach for Indiana. But if Indiana can put themselves in a position where they're at the beginning of April, on April Fool's Day, if they're 2 or 3 games ahead of the Bucks, they can drop a couple against the Cavs or the Nuggets, although we'd appreciate it if they got hot at the end of the year. That puts them in a position to defend the 4 seed, which, again, is important. And we know last year how the Pacers found themselves in Game 7s time and time again, especially in that Knicks series, of course. If they get Game 7 at home against the Bucks, that is a massive, massive difference, and I don't need to necessarily explain that to you. But let's get into the ceiling and floor as a result, because March is manageable, February is manageable, but really at the end of March, because of the lack of quantity of games, perhaps, the low quantity of games and the difficulty of them in April, it feels to me like the Pacers need to try to take a 2 to 3 game lead in the East, of course, between the 4 and 5 seed, in order to maintain that 4 seed in the Eastern Conference playoffs if they're 2 to 3 games ahead of Milwaukee at the start of April. In terms of standings positioning, right? Again, they're, to me, locked out of the 3 seed. They're 5.5 games back without the tiebreaker to the Knicks. They don't play that team again in the regular season. They're only 1 game ahead of Milwaukee. Again, they're 0-2 against Milwaukee, and they play them twice again in March. So the Bucks easily, if things stay the course that they're on right now, the Bucks easily, with just 1 win there, can take control of the 4 seed just like that. So the Pacers have to keep winning. They have to win the games that they're favored in heavily. They have to win the games they're supposed to, and at least at a certain rate, knock off some of the teams above them in the standings or in their area in the standings for sure. So they're 1 game ahead of Milwaukee, and they're 2 games ahead of Detroit, who they don't play again, but that's something that they need to watch out for, is the Pistons. They're right on their heels. So I think realistically the ceiling is the 4 seed, unfortunately, for the Pacers. But really look out in terms of the floor, because this floor could really fall out between the feet of the Indiana Pacers if Detroit and Milwaukee get hot and the Pacers start to sputter out of the All-Star break. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the Pacers will be fine, but it's something to pay attention to, right? Because Indiana, again, is a team that is sure in control of the 4 seed, and they have been for a while, but they're barely above Milwaukee, and they're barely above Detroit. They should be able to hold strong and pick up the 4 seed. Even though the Pacers are presumably in the playoffs, right? They'll be in the top 6, most likely. Even though that's the case, most likely, these pivotal games are still pivotal, right? If the Pacers are playing someone even-keeled with them in the standings, those Bucks games in March, they play them twice in a week. Those 2 games against Milwaukee are going to be massive and big-time games to watch in terms of the East standings. And there's plenty of those. They play the Timberwolves twice in March. They'll play the Mavericks too. We'll see if Anthony Davis is back by then. The Pacers have some big-time games against some big star power in March, even though the schedule is manageable with there being 17 games and quite a few of them being against teams like the Wizards and the Hornets. The Pacers still have a lot to keep track of, and they have a lot to hold down and a lot to stay on top of, perhaps. Because if Indiana starts to slip, Milwaukee and Detroit rather could round into form, and next thing you know, against some division opponents, you've fallen out of the top 4, and you find yourself as a 6 seed again, having to go